The smell of wood smoke and river clay hung in the air the morning Vera's last neighbor packed up and left. She didn't watch them go. She heard the wagon wheels on the frozen gravel, heard the creak and groan of the axle as it turned north toward the Caribou Road, and she stood at the kitchen window with both hands wrapped around a tin cup that had gone cold. Outside, the October sky was the color of old pewter. The spruce trees across the creek stood perfectly still. She was 28 years old, and as of that morning, the nearest living soul was 11 miles away. That hadn't been the plan. The plan had been Thomas. The plan had been the two of them, and the land grant, and the cabin they'd spent all of the previous summer building, log by log out of timber they'd cut themselves. The plan had been children, eventually. A dog. Maybe a milk cow. Thomas had drawn diagrams on the backs of flour sacks, where the barn would go, where they'd sink the new well. How they'd angle the kitchen garden to catch the afternoon light. Thomas died in March. A river crossing that looked safe and wasn't. His horse made it. He didn't. By the time the news found her, she'd been staying with his cousin's family in Quesnel. The ground had thawed enough to bury him, and she'd spent the next 3 months in a kind of functional fog, moving through rooms and meals and conversations without really being inside any of them. Then somewhere in late June, she made a decision, the only one that felt like it belonged to her. She was going to the land, their land. The cabin Thomas had planned with flour sack diagrams, and she had helped build with her own 2 hands. She was going to winter there. Everyone told her not to. She went anyway. The cabin was sound. That was the first surprise. She'd half expected it to feel abandoned in some catastrophic way. Roof caved, walls warping, some evidence of disaster to confirm the disaster she felt inside. But it was just a cabin. Solid walls, tight chinking, a good stone hearth. Thomas had built it to last, and it had lasted. She stood in the doorway the morning she arrived, September 2nd, with the light coming gold through the spruce, and she felt something she hadn't felt since March. She felt like she was in the right place. By mid-October, the feed store 11 miles north had closed for the season. The Hargreaves family, who'd been her closest neighbors, pulled out the same week. Husband, wife, 4 children. 2 of the children still young enough to be carried. They'd tried to get her to come with them. She'd declined politely, the way you decline something you've already thought through. So many times it no longer feels like a decision. She had enough flour, enough salt pork, a root cellar with turnips and potatoes, and 3 dozen jars of preserved things she'd spent August putting up, enough split wood stacked against the south wall to last until February, and a good stand of timber within easy snowshoe distance for after that. She had Thomas's rifle, which she'd learned to shoot the previous winter in a bout of practical mindedness that she'd never told her mother about. She had a cast-iron skillet that she trusted more than most people she'd met. She was going to be fine. The first bad night came at the end of October. Not a storm, not exactly, just wind, but wind off the Chilcotin plateau had a particular quality to it, a sustained, purposeful malice, as if it was looking for gaps. It found the gap under the south door, and the gap around the stovepipe collar, and it found something in Vera. Herself, some gap she hadn't known, was there, and it sat in it. All night, making a low sound like something grieving. She didn't sleep. She lay on her bunk with the blankets up to her chin, and listened to the cabin. And she thought about Thomas's flour sack. Diagrams. She thought about how he'd drawn the barn in 3 different places before settling on the east side, how he'd erased the pencil lines so many times the paper had gone soft. She thought about how she'd laughed at him for it, for caring so much about where a barn would go. She hadn't laughed at anything since March. By morning the wind had dropped, and there were 4 inches of new snow, and she got up and lit the stove and made porridge, and told herself that was a perfectly adequate way to begin a day. It was. She told herself that a lot that winter. The man appeared on a Thursday in November. She knew it was Thursday because she kept a tally on the door frame. A small thing, a private thing, a way of staying oriented in time, when time had started to feel like something that happened to other people. She'd just come in from checking the snares she'd set along the creek when she heard it. The sound of something large moving through the spruce on the far side of the yard. She didn't panic. She'd heard bears before, though they should have been denned up by now, and she'd heard elk, and she'd heard the wind doing things to deadfall that sounded improbably like footsteps. She set down the 2 snowshoe hares she'd taken from the snares and reached back inside the door for the rifle and stood on the porch, step in the grey November light, and waited. What came out of the trees was not a bear. He was tall. Exceptionally tall, the kind of height that reads as wrong outdoors because it throws off your sense of scale. Broad through the shoulders, wearing a canvas coat so worn it had stopped having a colour, and a wool cap pulled low. A pack on his back that looked heavy enough to bend a smaller man. He was moving carefully, the way a person moves when they're not sure of the reception, and when he saw her standing on the porch step with the rifle he stopped. Not startled, just stopped, like he'd expected something of the sort. They looked at each other across the yard for a moment. "I'm not looking for trouble," he said. His voice was low, roughed up, like he didn't use it much. Saw the smoke from the ridge. Wasn't sure there'd be anyone home this late in the season. "There is," Vera said. "I can see that." He didn't move. "I'm passing through to the Nechako side." The upper trails drifted in. "I've been going since before first light." She looked at him, at his face, which was weathered to the texture of something that had been outside for a long time, at his hands, which were bare and red with cold, at his pack, which was well made and well used, and didn't look like anything a man would carry if he intended to make trouble. It looked like the pack of someone who lived in the bush, the same way she lived in this cabin, as a practical matter. She didn't lower the rifle. "The upper trail's been drifted in since the 14th, she said. "You'll have to go around by the creek. Another 4 miles, but it's passable." He nodded slowly. "Thank you." He didn't move immediately. She could see he was calculating something. The light, probably, or the cold, or both. He'd been going since before first light, and the afternoon was already failing. Another 4 miles in this temperature, with that pack, and arriving somewhere. Where? She didn't know this man. She didn't know what was on the Nechako side for him, or whether there was anything at all. What she said next surprised her. "Have you eaten?" He blinked. Something moved across his face. Not quite surprise, more like the careful re-evaluation of a situation he'd thought he understood. "Not since this morning," he said. She looked at him for another moment. The rifle was cold in her hands. The light was going fast now, the way it did in November, dropping out of the sky in a matter of minutes. The 2 hares she'd taken from the snares were lying on the porch step beside her. "Then come in," she said. "I've got hare stew, and I made too much bread yesterday." He came to the porch steps and stopped there, below her, which she understood. You don't step past a woman with a rifle without being invited past. "I won't be any trouble to you," he said. "I know," she said. She wasn't sure she did know, but she'd said it, and somehow it felt true. His name was Cormac. He told her that over the stew, which he ate with the careful attention of someone who has been genuinely hungry and knows it. Not wolfing, not performance, just present with it, working through the bowl steadily, soaking the bread. She watched him without being obvious about it and thought, this man has eaten alone for a very long time. He'd been trapping the Chilcotin plateau for 6 years, he said, when she asked. Before that, he'd worked timber operations up near Prince George. Before that, she didn't ask and he didn't offer. "Do you go to town?" she asked. "Twice a year," he said. "Spring to sell, fall to provision." He paused. "I'm later than usual this fall." She didn't ask why. Some things you don't ask. He slept in the barn. She'd offered the floor by the stove. The barn was cold, and she was practical. And he'd declined without making a thing of it, just picked up his pack and said he'd be fine in the barn, and thank you for the meal. She gave him 2 extra blankets and the lantern. In the morning she found the blankets folded at the barn door, and both the water troughs broken free of their ice and the entire wood rack restacked, which had been listing to one side for 2 weeks and threatening to tip. He was gone. She stood in the yard in the early morning cold and looked at the restacked wood and felt something she couldn't name and didn't try to. He came back 11 days later. She was at the woodpile when she heard him coming through the spruce, and this time she knew the sound. Or thought she did, because she'd been listening for it without admitting she was listening for it. She turned around and he was at the edge of the trees. Different pack this time, smaller, and a brace of spruce grouse hanging from his hand. "The Nechako trail's gone completely," he said. "Ice took out the bridge at Kilby Creek. I'll need to go around the long way come spring." She looked at him. "That's 4 months." "Yes." The silence stretched between them. She was aware of the cold, of the wind in the spruce, of the fact that she hadn't spoken to another person since the Hargreaves left, and that this man was standing at the edge of her yard, holding spruce grouse and not asking her anything, just stating facts and waiting. "You'd need somewhere to winter," she said. "The barn would do." She almost said no. She rehearsed it in her head. The reasonable objections, the sensible concerns, the things her mother would have said. She didn't know this man. This was a remote property in the Chilcotin, and she was a woman alone, and these were the kinds of situations that cautionary stories were made of. Then she looked at his hands, which were red and cracked, and at the spruce grouse, and at the sky behind him, which was the color that meant snow before nightfall, and she said, "The barn's cold. I've been colder." Cormac said, "There's a storeroom off the back of the cabin," she said. "It's not large, but it's insulated." He looked at her steadily. "I would need to earn that." "Yes," she said, "you would." And that was how it was arranged. He was not easy company, but he was not hard company either. He existed in a way she hadn't expected, quietly, without taking up more space than he needed to, without demanding things. He rose before she did, and she would come out in the mornings to find the stove already lit and the kettle on, and she would pour herself a cup, and he would already be outside, doing something useful, and they would not speak for an hour or more, and it didn't feel like silence so much as shared occupation. He knew things she didn't. He knew how to read the snowpack, how to tell when an early thaw was followed by a hard refreeze, how to set a trap for ermine along creek margins, how to read the sky the way Thomas had read floor plans. She watched him do these things without asking him to explain them. And sometimes he explained anyway. Brief and practical. That cloud pattern means 2 days of clear after the storm. This is where the rabbits will run when the snow gets heavy. If you see the ravens gathering on the east ridge, something's died overnight. She taught him nothing intentional. But she noticed that he started drinking his coffee the way she drank hers. Too hot, too fast, black. He did not ask about Thomas. The evidence of Thomas was everywhere. The flour sack diagrams she'd pinned to the wall, the initials carved into the door frame, the second set of snowshoes hanging in the barn that were too large to be hers. He saw all of it and said nothing, which was exactly right. She had not been able to talk about Thomas to anyone. What she had found, in the months since March, was that other people's attempts to address it, the condolences, the well-meant questions, the careful faces, had made her feel like she was behind glass, watching her own grief from the outside. Cormac's silence didn't put glass between them. It just let things be. In December, the temperature dropped to -30 and held there for 9 days. She had stacked enough wood. She had always known she had enough wood, and she did have enough wood. But when it hits 30 below and holds, you start doing mathematics you hadn't meant to do. She found herself counting logs in the dark, running through her stores, recalculating. The root cellar was holding. The animals, she had 4 chickens she'd acquired from the Hargreaves before they left. Impractical, but she'd taken them anyway, were alive in their small coop, insulated with loose straw and keeping each other warm. She didn't tell Cormac she was nervous, but on the 4th night of the deep freeze, she came to Porth-Based. She came out at 2 in the morning because she'd heard something she couldn't identify, and she found him in the yard, crouched at the corner of the chicken coop with a lantern, reinforcing the gap in the skirting that the cold was working through. She stood in the doorway in her wool coat over her nightgown and watched him work. "Go back inside," he said without turning around. "The cold'll get into the kitchen. What did you hear?" "Nothing. I checked it because I thought it needed checking." She stood there another moment. "Come in when you're done," she said. "I'll make tea." He came in, eventually, stomping the cold off his boots in the lean-to, and she had the tea made and the stove banked up, and they sat at the kitchen table across from each other in the lamplight and didn't say very much. She told him about the Hargreaves leaving. He told her about a winter he'd spent at a camp on the Stewart River, just him and 2 other men, and a dog that turned out to be more work than both men combined. It was the most he'd said at once since he arrived. She refilled his tea without asking. The crisis, when it came in January, and it did not come from the cold. 3 men on the upper trail, which had apparently opened again, or someone had decided was open enough. They arrived at midday when Cormac was in the timber, and she was at the creek pulling the ice trap. She heard the horses before she saw them. 3 sets of hooves on the frozen ground, moving at a pace that wasn't quite right, too deliberate, the kind of pace that happens when people are trying to seem casual and aren't. She got herself back to the cabin before they reached the yard. She had the rifle, which she'd started carrying when she went to the creek after a coyote had been working the area. She didn't run. She walked, steadily, and she was on the porch step, with the rifle grounded against her leg by the time they rode into the yard. 3 men. One she didn't know, one she recognized from Quesnel, a man called Pike, which she was fairly sure wasn't his real name, and one who seemed to be with Pike the way a shadow is with a body. "Afternoon?" Pike said. He was smiling. The smile was the kind that meant something other than what smiles are supposed to mean. "I'm not expecting anyone," Vera said. "We were passing through, heard there was a place." "There's a place," she said, "and I'm in it." Pike's smile stayed fixed. He was looking at the cabin, not at her, the way you look at a thing you're assessing for its value. "That's a lot of cabin, for one person. I manage. Wondered if you'd want some help with that. Through the winter." She felt the cold differently then, a different quality of cold, and kept her face the way she'd learned to keep it. "I have what I need," she said. "Sure you do." He still wasn't looking at her directly, though we heard this was a widow place. "Figured you might be short some things a widow gets short on." She didn't answer. She shifted the rifle, not raising it, just enough to make the shift visible. "Problem?" Pike said, and now he did look at her, and the smile dropped a few degrees. "I think you should keep on," Vera said. "There's nothing here for you." What happened next happened quickly, and without much talking, which was how the things that happen in that country tend to happen. Cormac came out of the trees. He didn't run. He just appeared, the way he'd appeared the first time. That same particular quality of presence, large and unhurried, coming across the snow in no apparent rush. He had his axe in one hand, the working axe he used on the timber, not carried like a weapon, just carried. He'd been working. He'd heard something. He stopped beside the porch step without looking at Vera, his eyes on the 3 horses and the 3 men on them. "Gentlemen," he said. The single word had a quality to it that required no elaboration. Pike looked at him for a long moment. Something moved across his face, an assessment, and then the result of the assessment. He glanced at Vera, who had not moved, and then back at Cormac, who had not moved either. "Didn't know you had help," Pike said. "Now you know," Cormac said. They left. It took a few more minutes, the face-saving kind of minutes that men like Pike need. But they left. Vera didn't move until the sound of the horses had gone completely, until the spruce had absorbed it. Then she let out a breath she'd been holding so long it felt like it had been in her lungs since January. How long were you in the trees? She said. A while, Cormac said. Why didn't you come out sooner? He was quiet for a moment. You were handling it. She looked at him. I was watching to see if you needed me to, he said. You didn't, until you did. She thought about that for the rest of the afternoon, about the difference between that and the way other men handled things. The rushing in, the taking over, the gentle removal of agency in the name of protection. He'd watched. He'd let her be the one standing on the step with the rifle. He'd come when the situation changed. She didn't say any of this. She made dinner, and they ate it, and afterward she heated water on the stove and told him plainly that she was boiling his coat and his wool shirt and whatever else needed it, because she'd been putting it off on account of not quite knowing how to say it, and he could wear the spare canvas jacket that had been Thomas's while it dried. He accepted this without comment, which she appreciated, and handed over the coat and the shirt, and wore Thomas's canvas jacket for 2 days while everything aired and dried and aired again, and she re-sewed a seam in the coat that had been failing and didn't tell him she'd done it. February came in mild and then got mean again, the way February does. She'd started leaving a cup of coffee on the storeroom windowsill in the mornings. A small thing, a thing she didn't particularly think about, that she noticed had become a habit around the time. She noticed she was grinding slightly more coffee each morning to account for 2 cups. He never mentioned it. It was just there, and then it was gone, and the cup was washed and back on the shelf by the time she came in from the morning chores. They talked more, those weeks, not about large things, mostly about the weather, the traps, the chickens, one of whom had stopped laying, and was eating everyone else's food, which was a situation with a practical resolution that neither of them discussed. About the land, she'd started telling him about Thomas's flour sack diagrams just briefly, in the practical way that you might refer to a building plan. And he'd listened and then asked where Thomas had placed the barn, and she'd told him and he'd said, "East side is right, catches the morning light and keeps the prevailing wind off." She'd had to put down what she was doing for a moment after that. Just for a moment, she asked him once, in late February, why he'd come back from the Nechako trail. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. They were at the table, evening. The lamp lit, and he was working over a piece of harness, leather that wanted mending, and she was doing the books, such as they were. Mostly a column of numbers that tracked what was left of what she'd brought in and what she'd expect to need until spring. The bridge going out was real, he said. That part was true. She waited. But I'd been on that trail before, he said, in worse. There was a way around. He kept his attention on the leather. I turned around because I wanted to see if the smoke was still up. She looked at the lamp for a moment. And if it hadn't been, she said, then I would have kept going. He paused. But it was. She went back to her column of numbers. They didn't say anything else about it. But something settled, after that, in the room, and in her. Some weight she hadn't known, she was holding redistributed itself into something more manageable. March broke early, a brief warmth that felt like a promise, and then pulled back, the way March always does in that country, the way it toys with you. The creek ran free for 4 days, and then iced over again, thinner now, uncertain. She caught the first smell of mud and pine sap, and something underneath both of them that was the specific smell of things beginning, and she stood in the yard with her eyes closed and breathed it. She heard him come out of the barn. "Smells like it," he said, from behind her. "Don't get ahead of it," she said, which was what Thomas used to say about spring, and she'd caught herself saying it a handful of times since March without meaning to. "No," Cormac said, "but it's coming." He'd be going when the trails opened. She'd known that. He had his camp on the plateau, his lines to check, a whole spring season's work that had been delayed by a bridge going out, or by a choice he'd made when he saw smoke still rising from a cabin on the edge of the Chilcotin. She hadn't let herself think much about the going. She thought about it now, standing in the yard in the March mud, with the sound of the creek coming through the trees. She thought about the coffee cup on the windowsill, and the fire lit before she woke up, and the way the cabin felt different in the evenings. Not crowded, just inhabited, and she thought about Thomas's flour sack diagrams on the wall, and how Cormac had said East Side is right as if it was the most natural thing in the world. She didn't say any of this. She went inside and started dinner. A week later, the lower trail was passable. She found out because a trapper from the Nazco side came through, the first stranger since Pike in January, and stopped to water his horses and reported that the Kilby Creek Bridge had been repaired. The main road was soft but open. People were starting to move. She told Cormac that evening. "I heard," he said. She'd made a proper dinner. She'd told herself it was because they had ingredients left from the winter stores that wouldn't keep for another season, which was true. She made a venison stew with the dried meat and the last of the preserved carrots and the bread she'd started that morning, and they ate at the kitchen table in the same lamplight they'd eaten in all winter, and for a while they didn't talk about the trail being open. Then she said, "Your spring camp? How long to get there from here?" 2 days, he said, in good conditions. "Will you come back this way, in the fall?" He looked at her. He had that quality she'd identified early on, the ability to hold a silence without filling it, without it becoming uncomfortable. He looked at her the way the land looked in the morning, without performance, just present. "What are you asking me?" he said. She thought about how to answer that, about the flour sack diagrams, and the barn on the east side, and the coffee cup on the windowsill, and the way the cold had 9 lives, and needed 2 people to keep ahead of it. "I'm asking whether the barn would suit you," she said, "in the long term." He held very still for a moment. "The storeroom," he said, "is warmer than the barn." She picked up her fork. "The storeroom, then." Outside, the first tentative drip of melt had started off the roof eave, a small and irregular sound, a counting of seconds that meant nothing and everything. The lamp threw its usual circle of light across the table, and across the flour sack diagrams pinned to the wall, and across his hands, folded around his bowl. And across hers he reached for the bread. The creek beyond the trees was beginning to move.